The ferry came in 40 minutes late, which was usual for October, and the dock at Priddis Landing was empty, except for a boy throwing rocks at the pilings and a dog that had stopped caring about the rocks some time ago. The town was not much to see from the water. A cannery at the south end with its rusted roof. A general store whose sign had lost 2 letters and no one had replaced them. A church hall that doubled as a meeting room and, on the 3rd Friday of the month, a place where men came to argue about things that had already been decided. The mountains behind it all were the kind that made everything below them feel provisional, like the town had been set down in a hurry and hadn't yet decided to stay. She was the only passenger who stepped off at Priddis Landing. She came down the ramp with a canvas pack over one shoulder and a leather roll of tools tucked under her other arm, the kind of roll that had been handled so many times the stitching along the top seam had gone dark with use. She was somewhere in her early 30s. Though she stood in the way of someone who had stopped counting those years some time ago. Not from carelessness, but because the count had ceased to be the relevant measure. Her coat was good wool, worn at the left cuff, where a person wears things when they work with their hands. Her hair was dark and pulled back without ceremony. The boy stopped throwing rocks. The dog did not look up. She stood on the dock and looked at the town. Not the way a visitor looks, assembling impressions, the way a person looks at a problem before deciding where to start. Her eyes moved along the roofline of the cannery, down to the dock framing beneath her feet, across to the break wall, where the concrete had cracked and been patched with something that was already failing. Then she looked at the forge. It was set back from the main street, a low building with a stone chimney and double doors standing open despite the cold. The anvil just visible from the dock, catching the gray October light the way iron does. The doors needed rehanging. She could see it from 40 feet away. The left hinge had pulled from the frame, which meant the frame had rotted behind the flange, which meant whoever had last done the work had put iron into wet wood and then been surprised by what followed. A man came out of the general store across the road. He was in his late 40s, with a left hand wrapped in cloth from the base of the thumb to the wrist. He walked to the edge of the dock road and stopped. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them made a performance of it. He said, "You answered the notice in Nelson." She said, "The ironwork notice." Yes. He had placed it 6 weeks ago. His left hand had been closed in the door of the supply truck in August, 2 fingers broken cleanly and the thumb not cleanly. The bones had set the way the doctor in Cranbrook said they would, but the grip strength was not there yet, and would not be for another 2 months at minimum. The forge work he could manage, the hammer work on a straight weld, but the detailed ironwork, the bracket fitting, the decorative commission he had taken on for the new hotel in Fernie, the work that required both hands at the anvil simultaneously, that he could not do alone. He had not put wages in the notice. He had written room and board and honest work and hoped that would be enough. It was not a generous offer, and he had known. It was not a generous offer when he wrote it. She was still looking at the forge, at the door specifically. He said, "The left hinge has been like that since June." She said, "It'll be like that in March too if the frame doesn't come out." He looked at the hinge. He had looked at it many times, and he would have said he had looked at it carefully, but he had not looked at it the way she had just looked at it, with the particular attention of someone who could see through the symptom to the thing causing it. He picked up one end of her pack without asking. She did not stop him. They walked across the road together. The room above the forge was small and smelled of coal and old fire, which she did not mind. There was a cot, a washstand, a window that faced east over the water. The mountains across the inlet were the color of graphite in the low light. She set her tool roll on the windowsill and did not unpack anything else that evening. Below her, through the plank floor, she heard the sounds of supper being made. A pot moved. A child's voice, high and specific, asking something about school. The man's answer, brief. Then, the sound of a chair being pulled out, and then quiet. She had eaten on the ferry. She was not hungry. She sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the family below the way you listen to rain when you are inside. Not attending to it exactly, but letting it register. 2 people who had found a rhythm that worked for them. Something built without effort now, the way fitted joints move without friction. The child's voice came again. She heard the word upstairs. The man's answer was too low to carry. She turned off the lamp and lay down in her coat and listened to the inlet. She was in the forge before first light. The coal was in the bin where he had shown her, the bellows in good repair, the water trough full. She lit the fire with the particular economy of someone who had been doing it long enough that it required no thought, her attention free for other things while her hands worked through the sequence. The commission drawings were on the workbench. She had looked at them the night before by lamplight after the house went quiet. The Hotel Inferni had ordered 6 sets of exterior brackets in a pattern that referenced the arts and crafts period without copying it directly, the kind of brief that required judgment rather than instruction. The designer had sent measurements and a reference image and trusted that someone would fill the space between those two things with competence. She studied the drawings again now in the growing light. Her father had taught her that you built a thing twice, once in your head and once in iron, and the version in your head was the one that mattered more because it cost nothing to get wrong. She was working through the first bracket form in her mind when the child appeared in the doorway. She was perhaps 9, in her school clothes already, coat buttoned wrong at the second button. She stood at the threshold of the forge with her hands in her pockets and looked at everything in the specific order. Children look at things that interest them, which is not the order adults would choose. She looked at the fire first, then the tool roll open on the bench, then the drawings, then the woman. What are those for? She nodded at the drawings. She turned one of the sheets so the child could see the design properly. Brackets for the outside of a building. They hold the roof overhang away from the wall so the water runs clear. The child came closer. She studied the drawing without touching it. Who drew that? A designer Inferni. It doesn't look like something that would be metal. No, she agreed. That's the job. Making something that looks like it couldn't be iron, out of iron. The child considered this. She looked at the fire, at the distance from the fire to the anvil, at the tongs hanging on their rack. Can I watch? She glanced at the doorway. The main house door across the yard was still closed. Does your father know you're up? He's making breakfast. That was not a direct answer, and they both understood that it was not an answer. She looked at the child, who looked back without flinching. There was something very specific in that look, the look of a child who has learned to ask clearly and wait, who has learned that the answer arrives faster that way than any other. She said, "Stand at the line on the floor, the paint mark. Don't cross it." The child went and stood at the mark as though she had been standing at marks her whole life. She took the first rod from the rack and set it in the fire and worked the bellows until the coal began to speak. The child watched without moving. She watched the iron the way she watched the drawings, with full attention and no impatience, which was unusual. Most children watched forges the way they watched everything they could not yet do, with the restless need to be doing rather than seeing. This one watched like someone who understood that seeing was the first part of doing. She drew the rod, set it on the anvil, and made the first strike. The child did not flinch. After a while, she said, "Why do you hit it so many times? Iron has memory. If you take too much in one pass, it remembers wrong. Small corrections, held long enough, become permanent." The child looked at the rod, at the shape it had already begun to take. "Like people," she said, not as a question. Then she heard her father's voice across the yard calling her name, and she went. He had not said anything about what he heard when he came to the forge doorway that morning. She had been aware of him there, at the edge of the light, for perhaps 2 minutes before the child had gone inside. He had a coffee cup in one hand, and he held it without drinking from it, watching them. Not with concern. With the stillness of someone who has seen something unexpected and decided that interrupting it would be the wrong choice. He came in and set the coffee on the far end of the bench, where it would stay warm but be out of her way. He said nothing about the child or about the drawing or about how the first bracket form was beginning to show itself on the anvil face. He looked at the fire instead, adjusted the damper on the chimney collar, which had been running 2 degrees rich, and went to his own side of the bench. She had not known what to expect from a shared forge. In her experience, smiths were particular about their space, the way musicians were particular about tuning, with a precision that looked like stubbornness from outside. But he moved around the space with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had stopped thinking about it, which was the highest form of knowing. She went back to the iron. By the end of the first week, she had found her sequence. She worked the decorative elements in the mornings when the light was best for detail work, rough forming first, then the refinements, the scroll work at the bracket toe, the chamfered edges, the particular finish that required the iron to be struck at a temperature precise enough that a 30-second delay at the anvil face changed the result. She learned the coal in the bin, which burned hotter on the left side where the old brick had absorbed years of heat and released it back. She learned to account for that, moving her work accordingly. He worked the structural commissions, gate hardware, anchor brackets for a dock repair up the inlet, the practical, unglamorous ironwork that kept the province from falling into the water. He was precise and efficient and never repeated a motion unnecessarily. She watched this the way she watched everything useful. Not obviously, not with the attention that drew attention, but cataloging it, because a person who had been doing the same work in the same space for 20 years always knew something that could not be read from drawings. On the 9th day, he set down his hammer without explanation and came to watch her work the second bracket. She was at the anvil, running the final taper on the scroll, the iron at the color you could only see correctly in the right light. She was aware of him without turning. She made the strike, the half-dozen small corrections at the base of the curve, then carried the piece to the slack tub and set it in without rushing. He went back to his bench without speaking. That afternoon, she noticed something had changed. In the mornings for the first week, he had tracked her movements around the forge with a specific quality of attention that she recognized. Not watching her work, but listening for the work going wrong. The sound a person makes when they have seen the inside of a forge accident and live a little bit behind that knowledge ever since. Brief pauses in his own work when she moved to the fire or made a strike he hadn't anticipated. The readiness of someone waiting for a sound they hoped not to hear. By afternoon of the 9th day, the pauses had stopped. She did not remark on it. She kept working. The hardware store was at the end of the main block, a low building run by a man named Burkett, who kept the screws sorted better than anyone she had worked near, and who had a memory for inventory that was nearly architectural. She came in the morning of the second week for square-cut nails and a length of hard-banding stock. She asked for them by specification, and Burkett wrote the numbers without checking his sheets, which told her he had been behind that counter long enough to carry the catalog in his head. There was another customer at the far end of the store, a woman in her 60s, sorting through a bin of hinges. She kept sorting. Burkett set the stock on the counter and wrapped the nails, and didn't quite meet her eyes when he took her money, which was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't asked. She had turned toward the door when she heard it. Low, not meant to travel, but the hinge bin was quiet work. First woman I've seen in that forge. She walked back up the main road without slowing. The mountains were in cloud. The inlet had gone the color of old pewter. She looked at the break wall as she passed it. The failing patch she had noticed from the dock was worse up close, a thin section the width of her hand where the repair had not bonded to the original surface. When the freeze came, it would open. She measured it with her eyes without stopping. The forge commission work was her mornings. The town was something else. She had noticed the dock lumber on her 3rd day, walking back from the water pump. The outer stringer on the south float had gone soft at the joint, the decking above it beginning to follow. Someone had laid a sheet of aluminum over the worst of it, the way people cover things they mean to come back to and don't. She said nothing. On a Thursday evening, she stopped as she passed and looked at it without crouching. Measured the distance from joint to joint, the degree of sag. Her grandfather had believed that a person who needed a tape for every judgment was still in school. She had been in school a long time. She had finished. The break wall patch she flagged to Burkett the following Monday, describing it by location, and what would happen to it in the freeze without being asked to describe either. He looked at her for a moment, then wrote something in the small notebook he kept beside the till. She didn't hear whether anything came of it. She went back to the forge. The rain came on a Saturday. Not the hard rain of a real storm, but the steady, gray, conclusive Pacific rain that means a full day and possibly 2. She heard it before first light, on the forge roof, a different pitch than the sound on finished ironwork, catching in the low spot at the rear drain where the gutter collar had pulled free of the downspout. She had noticed it on the second day. She had said nothing. There was no forge work in rain like this. You could hammer in rain. But the fine detail work required controlled temperature from the fire to the piece, and wet air in the forge changed both the burn and the cooling, by degrees that mattered. She came down with her notebook. She cleared a corner of the workbench, set the notebook open. She had been building something in the back pages for the past week, not the bracket commission. The dock. She had paced the south float 3 times now on different mornings, each pass adding to what the first pass started. Her father had taught her to take 3 measurements of anything before she trusted one of them. The first measurement was what you saw. The second was what you confirmed. The third was what you understood. She was working through the timber dimensions for the replacement stringer when he came through from the house. He carried 2 cups and set one near her without asking. He crossed to his own bench and began sorting through a set of gate hinge leaves that needed finishing, work that didn't require the fire. He passed behind her once looking for a file. He stopped. She did not close the notebook. He stood behind her for what she estimated was 8 seconds, long enough to read the top page. Not long enough to read everything. Then he set the oil lamp from the rear shelf down on the bench, closer to where she was working, so the circle of light widened across the page. He went back to his bench. She turned to the next page. The rain kept on. The lamp held steady. The dock lumber she started on a Sunday. She had cut the replacement stringer the night before, from a length of Douglas fir she had found in the back of the forge storage, tight-grained and dry, which was rarer than it should have been in coastal BC, and she had run her thumbnail along it twice to be certain. She carried it to the south float in 3 sections before first light. The float was wet but not iced. She worked by headlamp until the sky came up enough to manage without it. The job was honest. Lever out the failing section, sister the new timber into the bay, set the hangar hardware, relay the decking boards she had pulled up cleanly without splitting them. She had been careful pulling them. You pulled dock boards carelessly and they split, and then you had twice the work. Her grandfather had taught her that. He had said it once, with the particular brevity of someone who considers a thing obvious but worth saying once. She was setting the last board when she heard footsteps on the dock. A woman in her late 60s in a town jacket and rubber boots, with a key ring in one hand. She stopped at the edge of the repaired section and looked at what had been done. At the new stringer, the fresh hardware, the boards relayed flush and level. Her face was not unfriendly. It was the face of someone running all available evidence before reaching a conclusion. Neither of them spoke. The woman crouched and pressed the new decking with her palm. The boards did not move. She ran her thumb along the joint where old wood met new. She stood. She looked at the tool bag. She said, "This is municipal infrastructure." She said, "I know." There was a pause of some length. A cormorant went over, low, angling for the cannery dock. Then the woman went back up the ramp. She was almost to the road when she stopped and turned back and looked at the float. One more time, a quick look, the kind you give a thing you have decided about. In the afternoon, she passed the hardware store, and there was a paper bag on the step with her name on it, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Inside was a pair of dock gloves, the good kind with the leather palm, and a note that said, in the same hand, "The south approach to the break wall needs attention before February." She brought the gloves back to the forge and hung them on the nail by the door. He saw them. He didn't say anything. The teacher at the school came on a Wednesday morning. She had not planned for it and had not been asked. She had walked past the school on 3 mornings, and the third time she had stopped long enough to look at the flashing around the chimney cap, the way you stop when you see something you cannot unknow. The flashing had lifted on the east side. One good wind and rain got in behind the cap and went straight down the chimney housing. And then what you had was a rot problem inside the ceiling, which was a far worse conversation than the flashing. She came up the morning before the first real cold front with her kit bag and a length of aluminum flashing she had cut at the forge, and she worked by the gray, early light before the first children arrived. She was setting the last compression fold when the teacher came out. a woman in her 50s, with the composed look of someone who manages 30 children at a time and has made a thorough study of patience. She looked at the woman on the roof, then at the bag on the ground, then back up. She said, "Who gave permission for this?" She said, "No one." The teacher looked at the chimney cap, at the new flashing. She could not see the compression fold from the ground, but she could see the way the aluminum sat against the brick, tight and without gap, which was different from the way the old flashing had sat. She said, "Is it done?" She said, "Yes." The teacher looked at it for another moment. Then she went inside without further comment. Two of the children coming up the front walk stopped to stare up at the woman on the roof. She looked back. They went inside. She climbed down, folded her kit, and walked back to the forge. At supper that evening, the child talked about the school chimney, about how you could tell from inside when the flashing was wrong because the smoke smelled different, sharp rather than clean, and that it had been wrong since September and now it wasn't. She spoke about this as factual information she found interesting. She looked at her father when she said it. He looked up from his plate. His eyes went briefly in her direction, and she looked at the window. The child ate the rest of her supper. Outside, the first stars were coming up over the inlet. Cold front arrived on a Thursday. Not the hard freeze, but the deep cold that precedes it, the kind that drops 10 degrees in 4 hours and means business. She was at the forge before first light. The fire wanted more air in the cold, which she had learned already. But this morning was different. The coal running thin and fast and needing management. She worked through the 5th bracket. The scroll work on this one was the most complex, a triple return at the bracket heel that required 3 heats to complete without rushing the metal. She did not rush it. Rushing iron was how you got stress points, and stress points were how you got failure. And failure in ironwork was not the kind of conversation you wanted to have from a ladder 20 feet up in February. Around mid-morning, the child appeared at the forge doorway with a covered bowl. She set it on the stump outside, called through the gap that soup was there, and went back to school without ceremony. She watched her go. Direct, unhesitant, already halfway back up the road before anyone could turn it into a moment. She ate outside in the cold, with the bowl balanced on her knee, looking up at the forge roof, which needed attention at the ridge flashing on the west end. She had noticed it on the first day. She was washing the bowl at the pump when he came out of the house. He stood on the step for a moment, not looking at anything specific. He said, "She doesn't bring soup to people." She handed the bowl back without answering. He took it. He looked at the bowl, then at the forge door, then at nothing in particular. Then he went back inside. The second cold day was harder. The wind came with it. She had saved the north face of the Forge Commission's final bracket for last, because it was the most exposed face, and she had wanted the experience of the other 5 before she trusted herself with it. Every decision you made about ironwork in the first stage of a commission was a decision that echoed through the rest of it, which was a generous way of saying that she could not afford to get the last piece wrong. By the end of the second afternoon, the wind had come down enough to work with precision again. She finished the heel return on the final bracket and set it in the slack tub and stepped back. 6 brackets. The iron had cooled to the color of the dock water, dark and quiet. She looked at them for a while without speaking. In the morning, she came downstairs to find him at the brackets, not touching them, standing with his coffee cup and examining the scroll work on the 4th one, the one with the longest return curve. He had turned it toward the window where the light was best. She came to stand beside him. He did not move to give her space, which was its own kind of statement in a forge where 2 people had been managing the same territory for 3 weeks. He said, "The chamfer on the toe." She said, 3 degrees steeper than the drawing. He said, "I know." He looked at it for another moment. "It's right," he said, and went back to his bench. She went to put the fire on. The brackets she crated that afternoon, the wood frames padded with burlap, the hardware wrapped separately. She addressed the crate to the hotel in Fernie, and Burkett arranged the truck from the store. She helped load it, one end at a time. Burkett closed the tailgate. He said, "Good work." In the direct way he said everything without ornament. She said, "Thank you." He drove out of town before noon. She went back to the forge. He was at his bench. He looked up when she came in. He did not say anything about the brackets being gone, or about the work being finished, or about what came next. He picked up the gate hinge he had been working and set it in the vise, and went back to filing. She stood in the middle of the forge for a moment. The coal was low. The water trough needed topping. The collar on the rear chimney damper had worked loose again, the same side as before, which was a fastener problem rather than a flange problem, and took 10 minutes to fix if you had the right size machine screw, which she did. She went and got the machine screw. She fixed the collar. Then she went and checked the coal bin and saw it needed filling, and she filled it. And he watched her do this without commenting on it. Because by this point commenting on it would have meant commenting on a decision that had already been made. And they both understood that. That evening the child came to the forge door after supper. She stood there with her hands at her sides, not shy, but with the particular formality of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say and was about to say it. She said, "Are you staying?" She looked at the child, 9 years old. Coat still buttoned wrong at the second button. A smear of something on her left sleeve that had been there since Tuesday. She had been watching the forge for 3 weeks with the focused patience of someone filing information she intended to use. She said, "I think so." The child nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already calculated. She went back inside. She stood in the forge doorway for a moment in the cold air. The inlet was black except where the dock light made a pale column in the water. The mountains behind the town had gone invisible in the dark. You knew they were there, not because you could see them, but because their absence of stars told you where they stood. Her pack was in the room upstairs. Her tool roll was on the bench. She had not thought about the ferry schedule in 4 days. She noticed this now, not with surprise, with the same quality of recognition she felt when a scrollwork curve came right on the third heat, not because she had forced it, but because she had held the temperature long enough for the iron to settle into its own true form. Behind her, through the wall, she heard him banking the forge fire for the night. The particular sound of a person who had done the same thing in the same order for years, efficient and without thought. The sound of a life that had shaped itself around a place and intended to keep on. She went inside. Her tool roll was open on the bench where she had left it, the iron punches and swages in their loops, the handle of the heading tool worn pale at the grip. She ran her thumb along the nearest punch. Cold iron. The weight of it so familiar now that the absence of it in her hand would feel like something missing. She rolled it closed and set it on the bench and went upstairs. The window faced east. The inlet was dark. Somewhere past the tree line on the far shore, she knew the road that ran north toward Williams Lake, where she had worked the summer before. And before that, the pass where she had stopped 2 winters and not intended to stay so long. A person could mark time in a place without living in it. She had done that. She understood the difference now, in the way you understand the difference between a joint that holds and one that merely fits, the knowledge settling somewhere below the level of words. Her pack leaned against the wall. She had not opened it tonight. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the window and listened to the town go quiet. The dock light holding its small column of light in the black water, and above it the stars coming on one at a time over the inlet. The same order she had watched them come in for 3 weeks. The ridge east first, then the low cluster above the tree line, then the whole of it at once. She did not go to the window. She sat where she was and let the sky arrive. The ferry ran Mondays and Thursdays. She knew the schedule. She had stopped accounting for it. The stars came all the way in.